Welcome to Dope Wisdom. Come on. Intellectual spiritualism, life and recovery. And I'm your host, Yeshaia Blakeney. Enjoy. Welcome to the official Dope Wisdom podcast with Yeshaia Blakeney. Our guest this evening is David Wiss.
Shy B, you're a legend, man. Thank you for having me in your space.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. I look up to you, man.
Same here.
For real.
Same here.
Thank you.
Same here. I was thinking about it on the way over here, and I thought there's a lot of similarities between us. We both have parents that are learned and academic. We both have the burden of being Jewish.
There it is.
We both like to dance.
Yes,
we
we
love
do.
Music.
That's it.
We're both in recovery.
That's it.
So I was like, wow, we got a lot of similarities. So I'm happy to have you.
Yeah.
Your specialty. Well, first of all, let me let you introduce yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name is David Wiss, and I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a master's level RDN, registered dietitian nutritionist. It was a development after getting sober, realizing that nutrition was such an important part of my personal recovery. I wanted to share it with the world, and I realized there wasn't a platform for that, and it didn't seem to be a conversation people were having. So I remember thinking, what if I could start this conversation? What if I could study everything that's been written? What if I could develop some new ideas around using nutrition to support people's recovery? So after finishing grad school, I started Nutrition and Recovery to train nutritionists to come into treatment settings and to work with people in all stages of recovery. Early recovery, I love working with people. I've been sober a long time, and the food thing is the last thing. That's one of my favorite things to do.
So I'm still working on it.
Fair enough. As we all are. It's an ongoing process. Absolutely. So I love the work that I do. I got to feel like a trailblazer in some ways and develop some curriculum and some new ideas for people to consider, and also reframe the way people think about nutrition as well as addiction.
Awesome. Tell me, in your own recovery journey, what were turning points? Like just in your own thinking, feeling, behaving, what you felt like were crucial moments in your journey, and then touching on how the nutrition and recovery came to manifest in your life.
Yeah, thank you. I get it. Like I said, I get a chance to coach and counsel and educate people on changing their eating patterns and all that. I went to a couple different treatment centers, and no one ever brought the topic up. I remember at the last place I was at in 2006, I had a moment when I was like, I wonder how different things could be. I was willing to believe things could be entirely different, as opposed to what I had assumed before, that I could change little bits of my life. And I assumed that things would be different. And I don't know where it came from, but I had this like hunger for life. And I realized there was a couple things I had never done. I had never assumed that I was going to stay sober.
Yeah.
That was important for me.
Yeah.
I had never taken care of my health, and that was something I always wanted to do.
Wow.
Because I felt like uncomfortable, depressed, anxious, we call it. We call it all of these things.
Sure. Yeah.
And uncomfortable in my skin, we say a lot. And I had a lot of that. And I started doing fruits and vegetables and water and sunlight. And I started caring about how much sleep I got. And I went to the gym and I sweated, and I started to feel different. Like I started to feel clear. I started to feel alive and awake. And I knew there was more to it than just weight loss, muscles, fitness. And that's when I was like, yo, I want to use nutrition to improve my mental health. I think that there's something there. And that's the turning point. It was like, I want to be sober. I want to be clear-minded.
Yeah.
That was what I was. I was in a fog. I had thoughts that would come and go, but I had a hard time expressing myself, being the kind of person that says what I mean and means what I say. And then all of a sudden, over the first couple months of sobriety, as people said, damn, Dave, you look confident. You're standing tall. Your skin's changed. There's something about your eyes. I had this feeling. I was like, I knew of course I had, some kind of a spiritual experience, but I knew that there was a biological impact of the foods that I was eating that was important and that shouldn't be ignored. And I said, you know what, I'm going to run with this and see how good life can be. And life has gotten so good to be comfortable in my skin, to be able to look the world in the eye, say what I mean what I say. It's really, really comfortable most of the time.
Well, I'm stuck by the question you posed to yourself, or maybe it's the question that was posed to you, which is, I wonder how different things could be. I just think about the ways that our ego mind, right, the running words in our head, stop us from having new experiences, and where those questions come from that open everything up, right? I wonder how different things could be is a question that just opens up possibility. Yeah. Tell me about your spiritual experience. You said, of course not everybody's going to hear that and go, yeah, well, of course he had a spiritual experience. So tell me about that.
So here's one belief I have. Thank you for that question. I think a lot of people have a lot more spiritual experiences than they're willing to accept, embrace, and claim, right? So I think the fact that I had such a difficult time with my health, with staying sober, I had some legal problems, I had a lawsuit against me, family issues, you name it, right?
Yeah,
to get taken to a place where you could feel a little bit of peace, right? One could say that in itself is a spiritual experience. I believe that people have experiences often and have this kind of sense of conviction about it, but then it's fleeting, right? Yeah. And that it quickly goes away and the mind snaps shut and doesn't store it as a pivotal moment, right? And so one thing I started to do was assume that everything matters, right? And that those little experiences I had were all part of the greater collective spiritual awakening. And someone told me early on, they were like, claim your spiritual progress as opposed to like doubting it, right? So I see people, I'm able to be helpful to people in early recovery, and they have what they report to seem like experiences that are spiritual in nature, but maybe have some doubts about whether or not they should claim it as what it is. Maybe it makes people uncomfortable when you speak with conviction about having a powerful, profound experience that changes the way we look at the world, changes the way we think, changes our attitude. Those are things that make people uncomfortable. Yeah. So when you claim it, right? Yeah. Some people would rather not. Yeah.
How deep have you gotten? One of the little taglines on the podcast is intellectual spiritualism, which doesn't mean anything, but how deep have you gotten in understanding, making connections between your science background, which I think is probably, I know it's much better than mine, and spirituality and where those things connect? How detailed is your map?
Thank you for that. Yeah. So I'm currently in a PhD program, so doing a lot of scientific research and crunching numbers and studying different disciplines. But if I was to trace back that first moment when I felt like a scientist, I was in my graduate program, my master's program at Cal State Northridge studying nutrition. And part of becoming a dietitian is taking a lot of science courses, right? Sure. Like, all the chemistry, biochemistry was a big one. Biochemistry, you need to take organic chemistry. Like those are the hard things that people have a difficult time becoming a dietitian. You got to take a lot of chemistry. I just remember being a couple years sober and, being able to see the interconnectedness of everything in the world, right? Starting to get that feeling of like there's a oneness about it all. Starting to feel like there's no such thing as no one saw, so it didn't matter, right? Yeah. That things started to make sense. I didn't try to answer the riddle. I know that that's the intellectual spirituality that can be a little tricky when I say this happened because of this, right? I went through this experience because it's going to lead me to this experience. Sure. Well, I think that's all true. I think that spending a lot of time in the pursuit of answering the riddle can be problematic, right? Because you can subscribe to theories about why things happen and all that might not be that serving. And it might keep you in the small picture rather than the big picture, right? So I had a moment in organic chemistry where we were learning about how molecules bond to another and repel another, right? And there were certain elements, right, that have different properties. Some of them are very much, for example, they're missing an electron. They're very much likely to pull that electron from some other compound in order to make themselves stable, right? Yeah. So chemicals bond based on their charge, right? Positive and negative charges. Yeah. And I had this moment when I was starting to think about how certain elements in the periodic table have almost like different personalities, right? Some are more like bullies, takers. Yeah. They need to like take in order to feel complete. And some have an extra electron that they can share. Wow. And that like people are linked up based on their kind of energetic field, and that all these different elements have certain personalities to them. I started looking at the periodic table of elements, and I started to see like a human element to it. Sure. Right. And that really opened my mind to the link between science and spirituality. In the last few years, there's been all this evidence about the microbiome, right? Yeah. Gut bacteria, the 3 pounds of invisible life that lives inside of our gastrointestinal tract. And there's been some really groundbreaking papers and ideas about, us just being hosts, just being like, just like a planet per se, where all these other organisms live, and they're coordinating their influence to promote their survival and increase their fitness and get their needs met. And I've seen papers in the last few years that show that the type of bacteria that lived, this was an animal study with birds, was a predictor of their mating partners, right? That there was a way for bacteria to be signaling connection on a sexual level. And as a nutritionist, I've gotten really interested in this idea of what if bacteria were signaling human beings for consumption of food, right? Telling the host, the human, to eat or to not to eat, or to eat certain things, right? And so when you start connecting spirituality and science, it gets deep. Yeah. A lot of people think they're conflicting things. You kind of pick one or the other. To bring them together is a powerful way of looking at the world. Yeah.
It's something I say, and often when I'm working with people, especially when people have had, mental health problems, psychosis, etc. And a lot of the time psychosis goes to this very kind of religious and spiritual place, and I have my own religious and spiritual places, so I relate to it, but I also know they're non-functional, these folks. And so I always say, you have to have a spirituality that's broad enough to account for biology, cosmology, psychology, history. I mean, your spirituality or your religion can't be over here, and then everything else is over here. That's right. You got to be able to account for it all. Is what I hear you saying. Is I have this broad view that has to be able to account for what's coming up in reality that I experience. You brushed over something, and it has been a hot topic. I've read about it, but I would love your 30 seconds. Minute on microbiome, the brain and the stomach, all this stuff I've been reading about the second brain and bacteria, and give us some knowledge on that. Kick us some knowledge.
Quick overview. Second brain is a great term. It's been suggested that this invisible organ, we'll call it, is a significant influencer of our mood and our well-being. I think the big breakthrough is that the communication pattern between the gut and the brain is bidirectional, right? Is that it's not top down, or it's both, right? And so there's several pathways. For one, there's something called the vagus nerve. It connects the enteric nervous system, the GI tract, to the kind of back of the brainstem. And there's all these different possible signaling pathways that we don't know a lot about. There's a lot of research happening on the vagus nerve that I'm really interested in. Another one is just through the production of like metabolites and precursors and other things that end up in the bloodstream that eventually can reach the brain. One of the big breakthroughs in nutrition for mental health has been in the last few years, the discovery that 90 or so % of serotonin is produced in the gut, and that a big percentage of dopamine, somewhere around half, is also produced intestinally. So there's this idea that these neurotransmitters, particularly ones that we know are associated with feel good, reward, addiction, well-being are actually produced in the stomach by organisms that are not us. The interesting part about the GI tract, right, is that it's inside of us, but it's not inside of us, right? So, and it's hard for people to wrap their head around this. The GI tract is actually external. It's not your blood stream per se. If you were to conceptualize the human body from the mouth to the anus is this long pathway where there's all this absorption that's happening. Right. And so along that pathway, there is a whole world of life, and it gets more dense as you get closer to the colon. Right. So like in the mouth and the esophagus, there's organisms, but as you go further down the GI tract, there's more and more and more. And it turns out that, a big percentage of what we excrete as feces is bacteria. So it's really cool. We have research now that is able to analyze feces. It's a hot thing people are doing. I know I've been doing it for a few years. You send in a little sample from a bowel movement, and you're able to get through pretty complicated DNA, RNA extraction technology.
Is it like junk DNA?
It's actually looking at the DNA of the microbes. Oh, wow. So it's pretty rapid that you can get like an insight into, what species and what families are living inside of you. We don't know enough about them to make firm conclusions, but there's some ideas that certain strains are associated with different illnesses, both at the physical and mental health level. And in the future, I just see like this whole new world opening up of treatment possibilities. Like, for example, if someone's really, really low in a certain bacteria that's really helpful, how can we bring that bacteria into their system? And what are the effects? And I'm not just talking about taking a probiotic. I'm talking about much more aggressive interventions that are being considered. Fecal transplant is a hot topic. It's just really interesting. It's really interesting to know that there's an invisible world, right? It just blows the human mind right open, right? We think like we're the center of the universe. And
we are the center of a universe of other creatures.
That's right. and bringing it back to the spirituality topic, we've always kind of played with this idea of a power greater than ourselves, right? And I think that by that term alone, people kind of automatically start to think about the vastness of the universe, right? And the universe being this maybe one small part of something even bigger, right? And then this new idea of like, this power smaller than ourselves. Sure, maybe, greater, yes. But like on a much smaller level. And like this idea, maybe, what if these invisible bacteria have something even smaller than them influencing, right? And so it just puts the human experience on this scale that transcends time and space, right? And like opens up these new possibilities that I think science is really interested in. And as a nutritionist, it's really important because what foods people eat has a profound impact on the type of bacteria that live in their GI tract, right? So modifying nutrition has a not fast, a much slow, gradual impact on the colonization of bacterial species and essentially affects mental health. So when I got into this idea of nutrition for addiction recovery, this information wasn't around. It was more about like, let's work on treating nutritional deficiencies. Let's look at macronutrients. And now it's like all of that's great, but it's all on the sidelines. Right now it's like, how do we eat in a way that promotes optimum gut health, which can in turn affect someone's mental health?
It's so interesting. I mean, there's so much you said there, but what I'm understanding you saying is we have millions of microorganisms.
Trillions.
We have trillions of microorganisms that, let's say, constitute in some level our bodies. They're making up. I'm assuming some or all of those organisms are gone. We don't live. Is that accurate? I mean, you always have to have some microorganisms living inside of you to function.
When babies are born, they're somewhat sterile. They receive microbial influence through the maternal kind of placental pathway.
Wow.
The birth
Yeah.
is actually it really matters whether a baby was born vaginally or C-section,
Wow.
because the actual vaginal birth is where a lot of the initial microbes come from.
Wow.
So it's been discovered in the last few years that babies that are born C-section
Yeah.
miss out on that.
Wow.
So a lot of doctors are taking a swab
Yeah.
from the vaginal area
And putting them on the
and
babies.
putting it on the babies,
Whoa.
right? Because we've learned that the microbes are our friends.
Yeah.
We've always waged war on them. That's
Sure.
been the big mistake in medicine.
Yeah, it's funny. A friend of mine says, it's an old quote from a philosopher, and it's about attempting to make everything antiseptic, you know, and to understand that our definitions of clean or dirty or good or bad do not map onto reality. That an antiseptic body is not a healthy body. From what I hear you saying.
That's right.
Yeah.
I've always been interested in the common cognitive distortion of black and white, right? Good or bad. The mind seems to just need to categorize things into one or two of those,
Sure.
right? The common question I get from people seeking nutrition information is just like, I just want to know, is this good or bad? And the answer is almost always, well, it depends, right?
Yeah.
But people's minds seem to like that, especially people that are in recovery from addiction.
Yeah.
There's a natural tendency towards black and white thinking. Some could argue reasons why. One of the theories that I have, aside from underlying psychological stuff that maybe predated the addiction, is that addiction recovery is dependent on black and white thinking in many ways. You tell someone you're going to be entirely abstinent, right? Which is different than a harm reduction approach.
Sure.
But an abstinence-based approach is going to basically saying you need to be very black and white.
Yeah.
Right? You like no alcohol means none.
Yeah.
No drugs means not even a half of Vicodin,
Yeah.
right? Not even a sip of wine once a year. It means none.
Yeah.
So a person in recovery from a substance use disorder almost needs to have black and white thinking.
I think it's helpful. I mean, I think I was running a group the other day and I was saying, you know, one of the things that's really hard for a lot of people early in recovery to accept is the hard no. Now, you don't care about a hard no if it's not something you care about, but learning how to deal with a hard no when it's something you really want, that's tough. Right. And it's that with drugs and alcohol. I mean, there's plenty of gray, right? In terms of even how we're defining drugs. So obviously the, snarky kids early on in recovery go, oh, you can drink coffee, but smoke cigarettes, but you can't, right?
Right.
So they're right. There's a lot of gray there. But for once in your life, being able to set a firm boundary in a place where it's hard for you to set a firm boundary is an important practice in recovery. Period. You need to know how to do it. I need to know how to set a firm boundary in the place where it's very difficult for me to do that as sort of an affirmation for life. I mean, I think that's people's experience in recovery. I had all kinds of problems. My first commitment was I shall not drink, I shall not use. My second was I'm going to try to tell the truth. My third was I'm not going to quit my job. My fourth was I'm not going to cheat on my girlfriend, but you start with like learning how to draw a boundary,
Hold the line.
And then you wrestle when you get up here with whatever you're wrestling with. Hold the line. Exactly.
I want to say you run fantastic groups.
Oh, thank you, man.
And you got a great thing going here.
Oh, thank you.
I've seen incredible outcomes.
Oh, thanks, man.
And I want to say that both you and Adam have had a tremendous impact on my life.
No, thank you.
And I've been able to see you for many years doing this work.
Thank you.
Very meaningful work.
Yeah. Well, we both transformed in a place that beautifully, I think, allow people to be individuals. I mean, every place has its issues, but there was something about like, okay, here's basically how you do it, but go pursue it your way.
Yes.
And that was a message I got. And I think a lot of us and where we connected was getting that early input in our foundation of you get to be you and figure out your way. You don't have to do it this way or that way or whatever, which I think is great.
Such an important message in recovery.
Yeah.
One of the major criticisms with a lot of the recovery movements that are out there is that it's based on a a social hierarchy where there's someone that has,
who? I'd like to meet that person.
Right?
Who's in charge?
Exactly. The end all be all answer call for someone else. And I think it turns a lot of people off to be able to make recovery about freedom and teaching people to be independent thinkers, to be their own gurus, right? To be leaders and not to lean too heavily on people is an important message that's often missed in classic addiction settings.
Sure. 100%. So before we transition into recovery, I want to stay a little bit with the gut health. I just find that fascinating. So what I understand you saying is there are trillions of microorganisms that live inside of us. And when you say they're responsible for their production, some large percentage, 90%, I think you said, of the production of dopamine and serotonin that we experience, what do you mean by responsible? Are they actually producing dopamine and serotonin? Are they signaling for the brain to produce? How does that work?
So they actually produce a lot of different compounds. One of the other ones that's of major importance is something called short chain fatty acids. So basically, most people think when we eat food, this is kind of a mind blowing moment for a lot of people. When you eat food, we take for granted like what happens as it moves through our body and comes out on the other end. Most people don't really think about it. We didn't used to know as a kid growing up, I pondered these things and like, I just assumed that the GI tract, or maybe I saw some camera stuff, was just like kind of warm and like it did a little mushy thing and it just was able to like apply pressure.
That's exactly what I think.
Yeah, exactly. It just like does a thing automatically. It turns out that the bacteria that live inside of us are breaking down the foods we eat and turning it into different compounds that it then sends into our bloodstream as a feedback loop back to the human, right? So
are they eating the food that comes into us and excreting it, or what's going on there?
They're breaking it down.
With what? Do they have mouths? What do they look like? I'm serious. I don't know anything about these
little
things.
Pac-Mans.
I mean, what are they?
Yeah.
Well, what are they? I'm serious. Like, if you could look at one under a microscope, can you look at are they too small? Or?
Yes.
What do they look like?
You can look at one. They're just right. We don't have we have maps of what they look like, and people break down the different elements of it all conceptually, right? There's a lot missing. Yeah. But the point is that it's like, if you think about a human being, right? To make the comparison, we have cells, right? And so there's a difference between something being digested and being metabolized, right? Metabolized is when it actually gets converted for use, right? So this concept at the human level of metabolism is intracellular. So it's happening with all the different components of the cell, with the mitochondria and all these things people learn about in biology, right? The process for bacteria is still not fully clear. I'm sure there's a microbiologist that could break it down. But the point is there are certain substrates that they prefer. Is
a substrate like an environment or?
No, things that we would consume. The main thing that good bacteria are thriving off is dietary fiber. And then also ever heard the term polyphenols or antioxidants, a lot of the stuff that's in green tea or fruits and vegetables, et cetera. Turns out that there's a synergy between the breakdown of polyphenols and fibers and different components of the food that create output, right? And they're able to convert into other compounds that we need. So it's basically like we're feeding them and then they're feeding us back, which creates the symbiotic relationship. So for example, if someone is on the Western diet, which, we use a term to say the standard American diet or the SAD
pizza,
diet,
burgers,
right? It's mostly low fiber foods. There isn't a lot of fruits and vegetables. Most of the grains are refined. People aren't eating a lot of beans. There's a lot of animal products which don't have any fiber at all. So historically, human beings, when I say historically, I mean like generations ago, right? Tribal times ate somewhere near like 50, sometimes up to 100 grams of fiber per day. And the latest data shows that the average American is eating somewhere around 15, 16, some people lower, even 12, 10 or less, right?
Wow.
So what has happened in our generation, right? People that grew up in the, 80s and when the big food companies really started to make their moves, started to remove fiber from foods to make them more digestible so people would consume more. And then they add in other things that make it more palatable, right? It's the concept of food processing.
Yeah.
Remove things, add things, make them more shelf stable, make them more palatable, right? What ends up happening over not just the one meal or one snack or one day, but over like the course of someone's life, right?
Yeah.
You end up having a significant drift in the kind of bacteria. And I don't mean just at the individual level. This is happening at the community and population and planetary level too, right? But what ends up happening is the bacteria that need those good fibers and those good antioxidants that thrive on them end up like becoming less.
Yeah.
And then the other bacteria that are more likely to prefer sugar, artificial sweeteners, oils, some of the things that have been added into the diet get more proliferated and are able to exert their desire for growth of species.
Wow.
They found, this blew my mind, they found a bacteria that sequesters iron from food and that lives on iron, right? So we're not talking about calories. We're talking about a whole new world, right? And so I had this theory, like, cause I know people that are addicted to red meat.
Yeah.
They need to eat it twice a day.
Sure.
What if they had, this is a what if, right?
Yeah, sure.
What if they had an overgrowth of the bacteria that needed iron in their stomach?
Wow.
And that bacteria was signaling the brain to eat more red meat to feed them. And they have ways that they can do it by inducing dysphoria, releasing toxins, making the human have a sense of negative affect until they do the thing that's gonna essentially, make things manageable.
Sure.
And so I also got really curious about Diet Coke addiction. That's a big thing. We know caffeine's addicting.
Sure.
But then we find out that there's bacteria that love artificial sweeteners.
Wow.
So this chemical that's been produced by the industry, we're consuming it, and then it grows the bacteria that want it, and they're able to set up the craving cascade. Where it gets really interesting is in the last few years in animal models, they have shown that in rodent models exposed to morphine and exposed to heroin, they have certain bacterial overgrowths. And it opens up this really important question. What if there were certain strains of bacteria that had a strong preference for morphine opioids that was a part of the craving cascade? What if it was those bacteria that were responsible for creating the negative affect that kept someone in the craving withdrawal cascade? And what if we could intervene at the gut level to improve people's chances of recovery?
Let me ask you a question. Are those microorganisms and bacterias passed intergenerationally? I mean, you talked about the baby being basically antiseptic until it passes through the vaginal canal. But is there some, what's the word I'm looking for? Predisposition to certain microorganisms and bacteria that are passed through
so
DNA
this is
or
where
anything?
It gets really interesting. The discipline of social science is starting to move in on this because, it turns out that like bacteria is shared among people that live in
a certain region or whatever.
Yeah, in the same living space,
would make
right?
sense.
And that like the couple that have been married for 50 years that sleep together have similar microbiomes, right?
Oh my
Because they've been sharing, right? So there's a lot of interest in the nutritional world about the neighborhood effects, the community that people live in. And it's posing this question like, what if in certain areas there was just more obesogenic bacteria that were growing and exerting? It's totally opening.
Or peoples, right? I mean, I could assume that maybe whole tribes that have existed amongst each other for multiple generations have been proliferating a particular bacteria over.
There's like bacterial imprints that are kind of predictable. And so they're starting to map out the genome of the bacteria. And so we'll be able to make predictions about human health based on that. But just to really answer your question, we talk about human evolution, right? That like over time we have epigenetic changes that adapt to our environment and like gene
expression.
That's right. We turn things off, we turn things on, we evolve and adapt to meet the demands of our environment. The bacteria is the same. So but here's where it gets interesting. Their evolution is more rapid than ours. because their lifespan
Their life cycle shorter.
That's right. So their life cycle is shorter and they're evolving at a rapid pace. So we're turning them over. They're evolving to match our current GI environment, which is a reflection of our food supply. And so I'll tell you, man, as a dietitian that works in private practice, the amount of people that come in with GI related distress is going up. It's through the roof. Maybe it's because I've developed some specialty in this area, but most people that come in have difficulties with bloating or they rejecting certain foods. They have maybe some overgrowth. There's problems with guts galore. Yeah. And that's like the major thing that I've been doing with people lately.
So this is going to be a great plug for you, but it's completely organic. And just because I'm genuinely curious, walk us through the process when you're working with somebody that comes in with bloating or gut issues and dietary issues. I'm curious about the diagnostic end of that.
Yeah.
What your process is. Let's say sky's the limit financially, just to understand what you could do.
Sure.
What happens with somebody who comes and sees you?
It's so complicated because, with nutrition, I think a lot of people use a kind of formula, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not a believer in formulas because one size does not fit all. For example, someone might have a lot of rigidity cognitively. They might be have a strong history of dieting behavior.
Sure.
They may be at risk for an eating disorder.
Sure.
They may have had an eating disorder. They may have an eating disorder.
Sure.
It wouldn't be wise to get into like some really rigid elimination diets, right?
Sure.
That might be very much contraindicated.
Yeah.
So part of an initial assessment is figuring out where someone's at in terms of their eating disorder symptomatology, their proclivity towards addiction-like eating, their risk factors at the psychological level, which is going to inform the messaging that I might deliver, right? Yeah. So I get a good sense of this on the first session. I have some assessment tools that people fill out. But if someone is in a dire need of a gastrointestinal intervention, I might start off with a really high dose probiotic and see how they respond to it. Yeah. And how they respond might actually inform some of the next steps.
So how might somebody respond to a high dose probiotic?
Some person might take it and have significant improvements in their mood, right? They're saying, "Oh my God, like I feel so much more refreshed and more energized," right? And that's a good sign. It suggests a lot of gut brain bidirectional communication. Someone else might take it and be very disturbing to their system, and that might tell me that there's kind of a microbial war going on. You introduce all these really good strains. Yeah. Some of the more parasitic or pathogenic strains might be revolting in some ways.
Wow.
By the way, it's so hard to know what strains are going to be right for people because sometimes it's the strain itself that's helpful to a condition. Yeah. Other times it's the way that strain kind of competes with another strain and suppresses it. And that picture hasn't been fully resolved yet. So I have a lot of different probiotics that I use with people based on different conditions, some that are more mood based, some that are more, gastrointestinal based. And so usually what I'm doing with people is increasing their fiber. Right. And that has to be done strategically and gradually. Yeah. And then I'm assessing what types of fibers are more well received and which ones their body might be rejecting. And then it might point to possible, intolerances of certain kinds of fibers. It might lend itself towards some IBS related symptoms that might need a specific dietary approach. I've had some people come in that we couldn't figure it out and I had to refer them to a doctor to be tested for SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Wow. There's so many different ways that it could play out. And so it requires really close intervention, trial and error. People will keep a food log, right? But it's basically like a journey towards a little bit of trial and error. We might do some testing. I do a food sensitivity test with some people that can be really helpful in determining which foods cause inflammation. Sure. Because part of what the negative consequence of dysbiosis, which means imbalance in the gut is that it's increasing low-grade systemic inflammation, and that those are the types of conditions that promote poor health at the physical and mental health level. One of my research interests at UCLA, which I hope to be able to do, is to study neuroinflammation, is how inflammation that starts in the gut can travel to the brain,
Wow.
can reach the amygdala where we have depression, anxiety, craving. This is
Wow.
going to be the gate towards linking nutrition and mental health. So
Wow.
at the end of the day, there isn't a formula.
Sure.
There's a lot of steps, which requires someone coming in multiple times,
Wow.
figuring out what's working and what's not, eventually moving people towards a diet that's high in fiber, and with some people, very specific fibers and maybe less of some others.
Yeah.
So it's tricky.
Yeah.
But people end up feeling better. They have this kind of, if you've had irregular bowel movements for a long time,
Yeah.
eventually you get regular
Yeah.
and people feel proud.
What's
and
an
I'm like,
irregular bowel movement? Does that mean you're not doing it enough?
it's on
What does that mean?
it's on a pattern that's unpredictable, and the consistency is unpredictable.
I'm predictable, but
Okay.
not in a way that my wife appreciates.
Understood.
Quick question.
Yeah.
This is I'm getting some free advice from you.
Bring
or
it.
diagnosis. What does healthy feces look like?
Great question. In my opinion and experience, like it should be well formed.
Got it.
I
I was afraid of that answer.
You do want there to be like discernible structure and
Strong.
shape.
It should look like yesterday's kale salad.
You feel me? If you've got a lot of undigested stuff that you can see, that's a problem.
Yeah.
It means that there's some
Yeah.
passing through the track too quickly.
I got to come see you.
You know what I mean? We've been talking about it for years.
I can't afford it, no.
The day will come.
It will.
Sometimes people just need a safe space to talk about these things.
That's true.
And the intervention isn't all
true.
biochemical. Sometimes you just need like a place where you can like sort out through the misinformation and just get a place to someone that understands, talk about body image a little bit, and like people feel more optimistic.
It's a terrible sell. What I need to hear you say is, Shai, if you come in, I could diagnose exactly what your problem is. And
That's what
if you
people wanna
follow
hear.
my direction,
That's what people
you'll
want
be
to hear.
eating better. Your poop will be strong and masculine.
And you'll be able to just look back at it
And your
proud.
confidence is going to be through the roof. That's what
Proud.
I want to hear.
Proud. Well, the whole world
I don't
is-
want to work on it anymore.
Psychosomatic medicine does suggest that there are, right? Like I said, that top-down process, that people's, the way people think about things
Sure.
and anxiety and all that.
Sure, it's a big deal.
Can affect all that too.
It's a big deal.
It's fascinating.
I've been just personally experienced the intuition of my stomach. I mean, we joke about that, or we kind of throw that around.
That's
Oh,
right.
my gut.
That's right.
But when you become mindful enough, I've had experiences where things were happening not even in my radius. Now, there were things that maybe my subconscious picked up on at a particular time. But when that thing was happening, my stomach would hurt.
Mhm.
I would then have an opportunity to talk to the person and say, "Hey, was this something going on here?" And they said, "Yeah." And so I actually learned to trust my stomach and that stomach intuition. This was years ago. This was before the
Explosion.
TED Talks and all that stuff.
Sure.
But I definitely had that experience. I want to move on. There's so much there. I mean, the circle of life just got a lot bigger and smaller from what you said.
That's right.
And it's a lot to digest.
Well
You know?
done.
I want to be mindful of time and touch a little bit on your perspective or perspectives on addiction and recovery. And so let's start with a very boring question of how you understand addiction. It's a boring question, but you probably have an interesting answer. So
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Part of what I'm trying to do now is, and we use this term a lot, especially in an addiction treatment center, when someone comes in, you got to do the biopsychosocial, right? That's like the structured interview that's required by insurance, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I don't think.
Well, let's break down what that is. It's a biological, sociological, and psychological assessment when people are coming into treatment.
Yes, that's right.
Correct.
That you have to be able to cover all of those domains
Yeah.
in order to make an adequate, comprehensive assessment.
Yeah.
Yep. And I've always appreciated that word, and I'm trying to take it to new level, new heights, and really like not just look at biology, psychology, and sociology, but to look at the mediating pathways between the two, how they are connected.
Consilience.
I've always had the opinion that, addiction treatment could do more with the biological piece, right?
Yeah.
And that there isn't like a lot of attention to someone's nutrition and sleep and all those other things, right?
Yeah.
We do a really good job looking at some of the more psychosocial things.
Sure.
But to understand addiction does require having multiple lenses, right? It's really easy to go down the biological lane and look at, the genetic predisposition, dopamine D2 receptor dysfunction, to look at a lot of the different risk factors there.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by that science, and I don't think it should be discounted at all.
Yeah.
It's funny, as someone that's at a scholarly level, I'm able to see how different disciplines fall into the cycle of bias of their own work and start discounting the other work that people
Happens
are
all
doing.
the time.
And I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah.
There's strong evidence to show that addiction has a neurochemical component. Like the biggest consensus is that it's a brain disease, right?
Yeah.
But then, in the last few years, with all the trauma research, with people saying that it's actually not a primary thing, it's a symptom, right? Most people have an underlying set of other issues, whether it be PTSD, complex trauma, anxiety, depression that all kind of lead to the addiction. And that the addiction isn't the main thing, it's the secondary thing. And I can appreciate that to be true in a lot of people's cases. And then the kind of social lens is looking at, the community. Where'd you grow up? Who'd you listen to?
Identified patient, all this stuff.
That kind of stuff, right?
Systems.
The family system, all of that. I think it's probably safe to say that, everyone who is a real addict. And some people don't even like that term anymore, right? Like
addict or real?
Good one. Addict. Some people, I spoke at a conference, a little while back about nutrition. And I use the term addict a lot, and someone like hammered me from the thing.
Yeah. I'm in that camp. I use it because it's easy. I try to see people suffering from addiction. Fair enough. I try. I mean, I understand the critique.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
I got it. I wanted to say, well, I can say that because I am one.
I'm black.
Right.
I can call myself black. Talking about my people, what I mean?
People.
That's true.
So I think it's probably safe to say that if we wanted to be scientific and realistic, and, I get to interact with a lot of people in early recovery, that it's probably true that everyone has like kind of a unique combination of biological, psychological, and sociological risk factors. And that this assumption that there's like a prototype of an addict, right? Or an alcoholic is so silly to me. There's going to be people that are more psychosocial that like, had difficulties and they found substances to fit in. And there's going to be people that are like hardline, neurochemically rewired, like men who have lost their legs and will never grow new ones, right? Like there's no coming back. There's recovery. There's neuroplasticity, but there's a hardcore biological imprint that cannot be ignored. The future of addiction treatment will be able to discern between the more kind of body-based, biological versus the more kind of psycho or mind-based, et cetera. And I think that it's really hard to do, especially if you're thinking about a treatment setting, because treatment by definition is being scaled, right? You kind of have a model
to
some degree, right? You can individualize, but at the end of the day, like there's a scaling component to all settings to some degree.
For sure.
So, it would be great if people like knew what they were scaling and did a really good job of saying like, we're going to get this person to the place that's like scaling the treatment that's best for them. And I think it's one of the challenges with,
probably very similar to diet.
That's right.
Right. I mean, for a lot of people, I would presume you included, the community aspect of treatment was really important, that you weren't doing it by yourself. I think that would be odd. I mean, for me, I can't imagine like, I'm going to do 9 individual sessions a week. And I don't think I would have stayed sober for even 2 days. Right. And it would have been very lonely. So the community aspect is crucial, but I think you're 100% right that, you can only go down so many layers of individualization within a treatment program, and you have to know what your strength is and lead with that. the point you made about the diversity within the community that we label addiction or recovery is a huge one. I talk about it all the time. You put 10 people in a room who identify as alcoholic or addict or whatever it is. They're incredibly different, as different as anybody. And so the idea that everybody is suffering from the same issue is a totally false idea.
That's
and
right.
The idea that everybody needs the same recovery is a totally false idea. The thing that we also don't understand is why certain people that have a certain type of PTSD can use certain drugs and drink and not get hooked, and other people can. So regardless of your camp, or this person has a major depressive disorder, but for some reason, they smoked heroin twice when they were 16 and they didn't get hooked. And so none of those lenses account for why some people get hooked on something and some people don't. Maybe it's random. I mean, I don't think we really understand that at all. None of the models account for why certain people with certain problems get hooked on drugs and alcohol and other people don't. And maybe it's because we're looking too narrowly at what we're calling addiction as a coping mechanism, and that everybody that has pain gets hooked on something. One way or the other. Some things we would label them more healthy, some things we label them less healthy. And maybe because we're specifically focusing on why somebody does this, when that just happens to be random. The other person is in the gym 5 hours a day, right? And that's their coping strategy. And it's, relatively healthy. It's definitely socially acceptable. It's probably not healthy, but socially acceptable. Whereas obviously shooting heroin in the bathroom is not socially acceptable.
Right.
But the problems are similar. Everybody's figuring out how to cope.
That's right.
On some level with the pain of life, which tends to increase as you get older.
And we also don't think enough about the socio-cultural factors that lead someone to seeking help, right?
Yeah.
Like that just someone
sure.
ends up in treatment.
For sure.
Someone else might be in the same boat neurochemically, but not even close to considering seeking help professionally.
Yeah. Huge. All right. So you have a broad and diverse understanding of addiction. You've taken into account multiple perspectives. You think all of them have some validity. And then looking at recovery, how do you see that? I mean, I heard you saying, I see recovery of the future being able to have stronger assessment tools and be able to address in a more specific way the treatment that people need.
Yes. I think it's easy to be this kind of scientific idealist, right? As kind of the work that I'm doing now is like building models and thinking about measurement tools, right? Like ideally we would be able to model someone's addiction severity based on a combination of their genetic risk factors and their levels of adverse childhood experiences and then their co-occurrence of other issues, right? Realistically, addiction is such a large problem, like now, worldwide in the opioid crisis, like we can't even afford the basics, right? Like that's probably a long way away. So it feels like a conceptual idea, but, I think that I'm biased towards the role of nutrition, but I do think that, in the next 10 years, because we've established a lot of overlap neurochemically between drugs of abuse and food or in the reward pathways. We're going to start to consider the possibility that maybe we could do more biologically in the treatment of addiction. So not just necessarily group therapy, psychiatry, but what if, and here's the real challenge. Nutrition is slow and it's really hard to measure. So the likelihood of being able to show the scientific efficacy is very difficult. And so that's why I think it's...
Define that for me before you get into that.
Yeah.
When you say nutrition is slow, do you mean the changes that nutritional changes create in the mind, gut, body system happen over a long period of time and are difficult to measure?
That's right.
And what kind of time are we talking about there? If I... go through a diagnostic procedure, we kind of narrow what is a healthy relationship to food for myself and an exercise regimen, et cetera, vitamins, probiotics, et cetera. What are the timelines that I'm looking at in terms of being able to change how I think and feel?
Right. So vitamin research has gotten a lot of attention because that's something that you could measure somewhat rapidly, right? You could bring someone's levels up, depending on
vitamin B,
what it is, right? You could measure changes there. changing the ecosystem inside of your gastrointestinal tract is something that takes years.
Wow.
You can have changes that occur over the course of weeks and months, but doing the kind of revolution that I have experienced personally, and the kind of thing that I'm envisioning isn't an overnight matter. And once you're talking about like a nutrition intervention that's, a year long, 2 years long, it's almost unfundable, right? Because you can't control for all the other variables.
Sure.
And so what research will end up doing is looking at, pharmaceutical interventions, high dose probiotic things, fecal transplants, things that they'll be able to measure and control in both animal and then eventually human studies over the course of a couple weeks and months, manageable research. Right.
Wow.
So that's the major problem that I'm up against as a nutritionist, realizing how difficult it is. You can't conduct the randomized control trial the way you can with drugs per se.
Wow.
So it's one of these things that people are going to come to believe in and see more anecdote, be able to link animal research to case reports. But the actual hard science is going to be really, really difficult to demonstrate.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. That's deep. I had another question.
And that's what I want to do. That's why I went back, to do more academic research. Is like I want to be able to demonstrate that.
Yeah. Give me an example of somebody that you've worked with that you saw have massive change in their recovery and their mood and their behaviors, et cetera. And walk me through that a little bit.
I think my real specialty, I work with challenging cases. I think my real niche is people that have a co-occurring eating disorder and a substance use disorder. There's an intersection there. Some of the research shows that it's like up to 50% overlap, right?
Sure.
A lot of people have the underlying eating disorder, and then it kind of turns into alcohol and drug behavior, and the eating disorder kind of goes away.
Sure.
And then when they get sober, it comes back.
We make the joke about whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole, that's right.
Sure.
So I see that a lot. And so I've recently dealt with a lot of people, probably more women than men, that have bulimia and alcohol issues, right?
Yeah.
They seem to go together. Both the alcohol consumption and the purging behavior end up being very rewarding. It's really fascinating to understand, this actually links back to the vagus nerve. When people have been binging and purging for a long time, initially for many people, the binge is the big reward, but what ends up happening over long periods of time is that the purge becomes the reward, and that it has a very self-soothing thing. It does something to vagal tone, and it brings people back to a manageable kind of life situation. It almost, seemingly reduces the unmanageable effect of the underlying trauma, right? Whatever it may be.
Sure.
So I've dealt with a lot of women, in the last few months that have had the alcohol issue and the bulimia issue. And so we got to first tackle the famous question of well, which one do you address first? Sure. And I kind of have taken this mindset of no, we can actually address them simultaneously, right? We can do integrated treatment. That's the big hashtag that I want to throw out there into the world, to do them both at the same time. The problem with it in the treatment industry is that they're different licenses. So, it's really hard to, you almost can't treat them in the current model that we have. Some people are licensed for both, but I've had some great success stories with, people that were bouncing back between the two. Yeah. And then, getting abstinence from alcohol, getting on a regular kind of consistent eating pattern. Yeah. I use an app with some people to record their behaviors and thoughts and feelings around food. And then they're able to put together a little bit of sobriety time. Yeah. I'm thinking of 3 different women right now that I've worked with in the last few months. And then we're able to, stop purging. They're still maybe binging a little bit or restricting. Yeah. And then over time, they get engaged in recovery, get active in a 12-step program, start becoming accountable with their food. Yeah. And they're able to create synergy in the recovery.
Yeah.
So like the recovery
Yeah.
that they get from abstinence, from alcohol, and the spiritual component of it spills over into the eating disorder recovery. And this overwhelming sense of optimism and hope for a better life comes in. We're able to like actually get them solid recovery.
You get a cascade effect from the wins.
Yeah. And then usually identify some other therapeutic issues that need some additional therapy.
Yeah.
I'm able to send them to the right person,
Sure.
treat some of the trauma. And then I end up seeing them being sober women that are helping other people get sober. And then there's also this component of helping other people that have body image issues. That's one of the tricky things about eating disorder. With alcohol and drugs, there's this huge community, the altruistic movement of 12-steppers that are willing to like be there every night to tell their story.
Community culture.
Community is there. But with eating disorder, a lot of people get there. There isn't like there isn't a place per se. There isn't like a real strong 12-step thing.
Yeah.
So, there isn't a place where people can be reminded. A lot of people recover from that and then kind of want to shut the door on it. Like, oh, that was a fate. Like they're not, 20 years sober, 20 years abstinent from binging and purging and still talking about it the way they are. So, there's some movement there, but my love is to see men and women that have had difficulties with body image, alcohol, drugs, binging, purging, night eating, medications that affect appetite and weight gain, gut dysbiosis, difficulties there. Bring that all together and use a biopsychosocial approach to create real healing and then create freedom and have nutrition be an important part of that. Wow. And it isn't always like, all right, this is your meal plan, this is your diet, this is what you eat.
Sure.
Sometimes it's just a recognition that this is an important part of your recovery and that there's not going to be any extremes. What you eat matters. Yeah. And people seem to feel better. And then I've seen people end up carrying that same message to other people.
Wow. That's huge. I want to throw a recovery idea out there. It's something I've thought about for a long time. And it kind of comes from thinking about diet. And when I have a video coming out that's about this topic. And I believe that your philosophy aligns with the idea of what is our sort of relationship to food, right? I mean, sort of a holistic, integrated view of who we are and the colonies of bacteria in our gut and,
that's right.
Out there. And so I've definitely had the same thoughts about drugs and alcohol, that I think there will be a time in the future where we don't look at drugs as bad, which is just sort of the after effect that you have when you come into recovery. Not because that's sort of explicitly said anywhere. It's just, this is the thing I have to stay away from because it's not good. And there's all this fascinating research coming out where they're using what are still illegal drugs from the 60s now to treat depression, now coming back to MDMA to treat PTSD, ayahuasca to treat depression. I mean, all these interesting, they call them entheogens or psychedelics. And I've definitely had the view that at some point in the future, we're going to look at drugs and alcohol just like food, where we've come to recognize, and correct me on any of this if it's wrong, it's just a metaphor I use, that saturated fats, processed foods, and sugars basically aren't good for anybody. Processed sugars, right? By and large. Close enough?
Close enough,
yeah. Right? Like, stay away from the fried stuff, et cetera, right? And that fruits, vegetables, fibers, beans, et cetera,
that's right.
By and large, good for everybody. Obviously, you could have a particular constitution where, such and such doesn't work. And then you have all this gray in the middle, red meat, chicken, fish probably over here, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so I've taken that sort of view and said, I wonder if drugs are going to be like that, where there are certain substances that actually help people grow their consciousness, treat their pains and traumas, allow them to have more empathy, not less empathy, meaning allow them to connect more to themselves and others with minimal negative side effects and low addictive potentials. And then the other substances, the crack cocaine, the methamphetamine, the heroin, the fentanyl,
the good stuff,
the good stuff that, by and large, we say, that's really tricky to have a relationship with. I probably wouldn't recommend it.
Right.
And then there's stuff in the middle where, of course, if people can enjoy a glass of wine, it enhances their life. There are little to no, if negative byproducts. And I would assume the same for pot for some people, though I'm more skeptical with pot and how it works with our culture than maybe other people. But what I imagine is that in the end, what we're looking for is a right relationship with ourselves,
yes,
with each other, with the world, with our microbiome, with substances, meaning plants and chemicals and all this stuff. And what does that relationship look like? And being mindful enough to be able to be dynamic in how that's working. And I think that's completely problematic when it comes to treatment and recovery for reasons that you and I would both acknowledge. But at the same time, to fully address a human being's needs, the ideal would be to look at, how are you in relationship with your environment? How are you in relationship with yourself? Right? How do you feel about that idea?
It resonates with me. I've always been a big fan of looking at things on a spectrum or a continuum, right? Also acknowledging that there are no universal truths, right?
Yeah.
Even with the nutrition thing, like there can be an anorexic who needs to eat less fruits and vegetables and beans and probably learn how to eat more refined sugar and right? There's an exception, as you said, always, to every rule. And that's going to be true with the drug thing for sure. The problem that I see, and this has, been a big part of my personal journey towards understanding the world, has been an interest in the behind the scenes politics of the money and the corporate structure and the greed, right? Yeah. Like at the end of the day, like what's driving a lot of those products is like marketing and for-profit motives, right? So it's so easy to be idealistic about nutrition or substances in general, but at the end of the day, there's people that are looking to make money.
Is there a market there?
That's it, exactly. And so they're going to do whatever tactics they can to meet the demands of their shareholders, whether it be greed or just basic capitalism. It's hard to say, but I do think that as long as that's like the basis of the world we live in, financial exchange, products, consumerism, marketing, that it'll be really hard to make that kind of reality work, right? Because a lot of these big industries, they know what's going on. I use the term underneath the hood. I mean, neurochemically, right? Yeah. They know a lot about the reward that people are experiencing, the way that you can set up insecurity in the customer base, the way that you can drive consumer behavior, the modeling now that they have with what people buy, predicting. It's high level statistical stuff. And they've got the smartest people in the game doing the consulting work. So I always wonder how utopian, I could ever be with nutrition. To your example, knowing that the biggest driver is profit. It's so hard to imagine a world where
large scale change.
Exactly. I'm doing a public health doctorate now. And one of the biggest, most discouraging things is kind of this feeling of oh no, I'm actually going up against the largest industries in the world. The big companies that essentially influence government policy, right? That and I think a lot of people in the field that I'm in, at some point in their career realize that there are certain things you can change and certain things you can't. So let's just focus on the little intervention that we can do in the community. Whereas I want to go after the pharmaceutical industries and I want to do the big things. And, I could see running, I've already experienced a little bit of fatigue there. Knowing that right at the end of the day, it's sadly money runs too much of our world.
I think, we're digressing, but I like to digress. There's a lot of complexity there. I don't disagree at all. I worked nonprofit for 12 years and for profit for 3.5 years. And I've experienced the challenges on both sides and experienced the personal challenges of working in for-profit much more than in nonprofit, experienced other challenges in nonprofit. And I think the other thing that I recognize is that systems are incredibly complex. And so, as much as I could critique our political system or our economic system or the way we run our cities, counties, LAUSD is on strike right now. My kids aren't at school. I also recognize the difficulty I have in managing my own family. And I go, wow. So on the one hand, I'm very critical of the society we've created.
Yes.
And the parts of ourselves that we exploit, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I can be in awe at the fact that a society runs it all, because I look at, just trying to get my kids and my wife, Emily, around the dinner table consistently. And I'm like, well, that's incredibly challenging. How is it that we have a tax system with, 350 million people, and so it's both sort of recognizing the difficulty of it and the massive achievement that we have, and also not settling in some sense. Obviously there's not some great solution to that. I look at, and I'd love to hear your 2 cents on this before we end. I look at the Suboxone thing and the MAT thing, medication assisted treatment. And what became clear to me after, being on one side of the fence for a long time and then having other experiences that put me on the other side of the fence, is it's a matter of perspective. Mm-hmm. If I'm, in some sense a governor or something like that, and there are thousands of people dying in my state, and I got statistics that say, hey, putting people on the opiate replacement therapy will save their lives more so than not. I'm looking at, 500,000 people, yes, or 100,000 people, and I'm trying to stop the bleeding. And so from that perspective, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. Mm-hmm. Now, from zoom in down here, for me experiencing treatment, working with people who are, getting on Suboxone, getting off Suboxone, relapse, whatever it is, it's incredibly complex. I have major concerns about what that's going to look like as major funding comes into MAT. I'm not even against it, but I'm like, well, this is going to be really complicated and unpredictable as to what's going to happen in the long term. But eventually what I came to, it's just two different perspectives. Both are valid.
That's right.
But how you work within both of those worlds, I think, is incredibly challenging for all of us that give a shit,
Yes. I think that to be closed-minded to medication-assisted treatment would be absurd, right? Based on, like you said, the available evidence.
I think so.
Where a scientist like myself might step in and pose some concern is if you think about the basis of scientific evidence, right? Yeah. So in many ways, it's it's evidence-based, right? Yeah. It's the most evidence-based thing, but it's also, you can make the argument well, who's doing the research and where's the funding coming from, 100%. Right? Let's just say, and I know this is reaching, I'm way probably more convinced of the role of nutrition than the average person, but let's just say we could do a drastic gut-based nutrition intervention, do a fecal transplant, get people on high-dose probiotics and get them really, really transformed in the course of a month. And there's all that money for funding that they've used for their trials on things. What if that money was there for a nutrition intervention? We could demonstrate some of the efficacy. I'm not saying that it's better than that. I'm just saying there's no incentive to do that kind of research because you can't put a patent on food. They put a patent on their end product. So they're able to invest billions of dollars to do the research, to establish policy, and basically own a marketplace, right?
It's a commodity.
Right, exactly. So there's a strong incentive to show how efficacious it is. Whereas there's no incentive to show some of the other things. So I'm a fan of seeing people not die from opioids. Sure. I'm a fan of seeing people do a good taper on a MAT protocol. Sure. I'm a fan of all of that. But it goes back to that initial qualm, right? Is that it's still part of a capitalistic paradigm that's hard to get out of. And I'm not someone that's anti our society or any of that. You made a point about how in awe we could be. All of the scientific advancements we have, they're all from this capitalistic model, right? So I am that, but as a healthcare professional and as a public health researcher, it's so hard to not see conflict when it comes to private profits and public health.
100%. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any final messages or words you have?
I think it's safe to say that I love this way of life. I love being a sober man. And I love being able to walk this path with people like you, shoulder to shoulder, we bumped into each other the other day and we just had this automatic conversation that felt so real, and to be able to pick it back up, you know, cause I'm in the lab a lot, which in me is like at my computer, right? Crunching statistics and writing papers. And I don't get to be out in the world doing this stuff enough. And there's people like you that I respect and look up to, and we have important work to do.
Yeah, we do.
We have really important work to do.
Tough work.
You know, and together we can accomplish what we can never do alone.
Yeah. So I didn't say this. I said this before we were on mic, but I think about you because you've had such a massive impact on the recovery world of, you know, young people. I mean, not so young, but, you know, the 20s and 30s crowd in West Los Angeles, which is one of the biggest recovery meccas in the world. And you almost single-handedly, in the same way you're speaking here, and just your own inspiration, you know, for recovery and for growth and for health that you discovered for yourself, you spread that to so many people. I mean, I've counseled people that relapsed, got stuck, people that I grew up with, people that I worked with, who found you and what you do and transformed their lives. And it wasn't you, they did the work. But you know, somehow were able to allow them to see that in themselves and inspire them to reach a little harder. It's a big deal. I mean, when you think about it, just their lives, their kids' lives, their parents, their cousins, their brother. I mean, we know how this thing works. And the thing works that, you know, one person gets it. There's 5 people around that person. They get it. You know what I mean? 25 around that. And those concentric circles. And you've had as big an impact as anybody on people suffering from addiction in Los Angeles. So hats off to you. I wore the bucket cap in your honor.
We wore hats tonight.
You know what I mean?
We got in the spirit.
You know what I mean? And you've been listening to Dope Wisdom with Yeshaia Blakeney. To learn more about the resources mentioned on this show, or to listen to past episodes, visit www.recoverintegrity.com/Dope Wisdom Podcast. I appreciate y'all out there. Blessings.